Welcome to the ThinkData Podcast in partnership with DataWorks. On today's episode, I'm really excited to welcome Josh Claman to the show. Josh has over 30 years of experience within data center technology. This is seen in work for the likes of NCR, AT&T and Dell. He is now the CEO of Accelsius, who are one of the leaders in advanced cooling technology for data centers. Really good to have you on today. And I know we've kind of spoken off air briefly, but it's a space which has gathered a lot of attention for obvious reasons. AI, the strains on the environment, and actually you've really tapped into a real sweet spot. So would you mind kind of bringing everyone up to speed with who you are and how you became the CEO?
Sure. I've been in data centers, as you said, for a long time. And I was contacted by the founding sort of investor of Accelsius, which is called 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐿𝐻, about 2.5 years ago, or probably 3 years ago now. But we founded the company about 2.5 years ago. And it intrigued me for a couple of reasons. One, the data center market has been sort of glib about sustainability. There's been more lip service than action over the last 15, 20 years. And that's always concerned me a little bit. But then what we saw in front of us were these sort of impossible roadmaps of hotter and hotter chips. And we decided that we could do something about that by designing sort of a fit-for-purpose technology, which we can get into in more detail. But the sort of themes of AI enablement, of data center efficiency and sustainability weaved together seduced me back into this land of data centers. So, and it's been a lot of fun since then.
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously you've worked for some of the largest players out there. You've got NCR, I think you're kind of 16 years or so there. You've got AT&T, the Dell that obviously ended up bringing you to the UK as well to spend some time over here. Obviously when you got approached, I'm always intrigued by these decisions. Where was that inner entrepreneur in you? At what point did you think, do you know what, I'm going to go to a sub 50 person, relatively new business and do something which I've not done before?
Well, for me, it was a bit of a journey. I've had what I call a Benjamin Button's career. I started with sort of big tech with NCR in the early days of data warehousing, then AT&T, and then with Dell, 8 years in Europe with Dell, 23 years, by the way, living overseas with all of these companies. But then when I was with Dell, managing a large P&L in the Americas, I started fantasizing about having a bigger impact on a smaller company. And I don't think that's terribly unusual for people who get their start in big companies. And so I joined a company in ad tech as the president of a sort of a mid-cap ad tech company. And the reason for that actually was that my largest customers in my last position at Dell were these Web 1.0 people, right? Okay. At the time, Facebook and eBay and Google. And they were facing these challenges, but they were doing some really intriguing work around unstructured data. And I liked where that was going. I think that the advances in that were mostly around advertising. That was, I found, sort of philosophically discouraging. I would like that to be in healthcare or something, maybe a bit more meaningful to society, but it was what it was. And I became president of that company. And then I decided to sort of follow my nose in terms of technologies that intrigued me. And I went to 3D printing, became chief business officer of the largest 3D printing company in the world. And then I started doing startups. So I went from big tech to small. My last company was a digital health company. And this is my third early stage company. So in a way, I had a soft landing into this. So it wasn't a culture shock of managing thousands of people and big budgets. And then suddenly, what do I do? It's just me and a couple interns to start a company. So I had sort of a soft landing into that sort of culture change and process change.
Interesting. And, we have a lot of listeners here who are kind of really intrigued about what it is kind of to lead a business, this kind of size, especially in the space you're operating in. For people who are listening, and obviously you're the CEO, but what does that role entail? And if you look to kind of when you're looking at your schedule on a Monday? What does a typical week look like for you?
It's a really interesting question. I think a lot of times I think about what is my real job, and I think that sounds like I'm being flippant, and I'm not at all. Actually, I think one of my jobs is, and one of the most important, is to make the right decisions. To distill a lot of data points and information about the market, and try to translate that with my team into product development priorities, which product we put off, how we allocate resource, how we make decisions about what features and functions are important versus which ones can wait to a later version. It takes up a lot of our time. The other thing is I spend a lot of time navigating this changing ecosystem. So we're the newest technology in a very new sector. And so you have to think about adoption rates. You have to think about the relatively conservative buying population within data centers. Data center operators tend to be quite risk averse for a good reason. They tend to move slowly. They're being pushed now to move very quickly. So how can we help them do that? But how do we spend time thinking about the right dance partners, the right big partnerships that we have that can bring us reach and velocity and credibility in the market? So that's another key portion. And then I think that the last third is, and I think this is where age helps. Being a startup CEO can be kind of a young man's game, honestly. It takes a lot of energy. It's
a lot of people, but
it's a bit of stress. But experience, I think, helps sort of inform what kind of culture you want to develop, how you want to motivate people, how you want to align people around a mission, what type of personalities do you want to include on the team, and I think the experience helps also anticipate what's coming at you a little bit. You've sort of seen the movie before a few times. Yeah. So as much as sometimes I come home and I tell my wife I'm too old for this stuff, the other side of that coin is I'm so glad I have this experience under my belt that can help me sort of distill a lot of data points, drive a direction for the team, articulate that sort of transparently, and hire well. And I think we're sort of mid 70s now in terms of population. Okay. And I think we've hired really well. We've had very few missteps. The team's collaborative, transparent. They're all very curious. They're problem solvers. Those things can sound like platitudes, but when put in the right combination, it's a very powerful formula.
Yeah, it's interesting you touched on that because obviously we tackle, the business that pays the bills. Obviously, we work and recruit for companies within AI, and so a lot of these organizations will come in with these great kind of ideas of culture and how we're going to hire, but so many times that they get the hiring wrong. And I'm interested to touch on that briefly. Are you led from a cultural standpoint by the domain and the product you're in, or is it more around the people you've got currently? So what I mean by that is that because obviously with data centers, certain type maybe have worked in larger organizations, maybe less fluid versus maybe. So what's leading the culture?
I think it's the mission of developing really high quality products well and quickly. So we've hired engineers from the server OEMs, people that have architected servers and played with thermals within servers. They know back of rack topologies within data centers. They know what data center operators want. But we've been very selective within that sort of superset of people. We've hired people directly from big companies, from Dell, HP, et cetera. And we have to sort of reshape them. There's the thing about big company people coming into a small company. A lot of times they say, well, we did it like this. Exactly, and you have to sort of shake that out of them a little bit and say, well, we're inventing a way. You can take best practice, absolutely. And when something is non-contentious, then let's take that process, practice, whatever, put it in motion. But if something's contentious, let's really figure out what's right for us. And so it's that sort of apolitical, collaborative spirit that I think has really energized the team.
Yeah, and as you said, that kind of culture then starts to kind of breed its own culture, doesn't it? Then you've got that succession planning.
Absolutely.
And you're the one less driving it less, and actually you've got that second layer of management coming through. Yeah, it's really interesting.
On a most basic level, and it sounds sort of ideological maybe, and I think it has been informed by a lot of different experiences I have around the world. I want people to come to work and sort of enjoy it. Work doesn't have to be a horrible thing. And, if you treat people like adults, and if you align around the mission and the key objectives of the company and create passion around that, then you don't need all the guardrails of policies and, controls. You don't need all that. So, it's sort of an experiment, sort of a social experiment at this point. But so far, so good.
So far, it is going the right way. And I'm really excited to talk about Accelsius, the product. As I say, there's people who listen, who you've got the technical listeners, you've equally got the, just the curious listeners. But, summarizing, what is Accelsius and what is the problem it's solving? You touched on it at the top of it, but I'm really keen to dig on that.
So when we started the company, we had sort of a set of working hypotheses. And one was pretty obvious. Chips were getting hotter. Air was probably never an efficient cooling architecture, right? But if you blow enough cold air on something, it's going to get cold over time. But air is a terribly inefficient transport of heat and always has been. So that in a way, maybe the market should have done this much earlier. But as you see chips going from 200 watts to 300 watts to 700 watts to 1200 watts, there's clearly a problem in that. I think the consensus in ASHRAE, et cetera, these global committees, is that after about 400 watts in the form factor of a chip, air really can't effectively remove that heat. So the market had kind of gotten braced for that. They saw or glimpses of the roadmaps from NVIDIA and AMD, et cetera, and said, well, we're going to have to do something. So then, when we founded the company, there's this debate around air versus liquid. And even just 2.5 years ago, there were holdouts, right? I mean, we had these debates. We'd present a panel discussion at Data Center World or something. And, half the conversations afterwards, we've been talking about liquid cooling since 1985 and blah. And I worked at IBM when we had liquid cooling, back in the Jurassic Age.
Okay, almost dismissed.
And it was sort of dismissed. But I think very quickly, and I've never, ever experienced a market that's sort of evolved this quickly. In a year, it was like, well, we need liquid cooling. What liquid cooling? And please remember that even after we founded Accelsius, which is only 2.5 years ago, ChatGPT was released. So the impetus was hotter chips. The urgency was really around generative AI enablement. So AI enablement. And so then we said, listen, if we're going to move, if the data center cooling market's moving to liquid, how can we create a liquid cooling technology that's actually fit for purpose? And we define that in terms of parameters as being just a few things. One is, can we have a liquid cooling technology which is very sort of future-proof?
Okay.
In other words, it can't just cool the current chips. It can cool the next and the next and the next generation of chips.
Oh, so as those chips evolve, it's already kind of it's also future-proofing for that evolvement.
Right. It gets back to the old investment protection sort of discussion within data centers. And we thought that's important. It's a practical concern. We should address it. So we didn't want to have something that could cool H100s, but fail on Blackwells or fail on Rubins, et cetera. And we think we've proven that this technology, and I'll talk about why, but this technology is future-proof. The other is that, remember, the first mover in data center liquid cooling is water.
Yeah.
And our sort of working hypothesis was that we're going to regret this in a few years. We're putting increasingly high pressure water through increasingly expensive IT equipment. So remember, a rack used to be maybe $200,000, $250,000 worth of equipment in the rack. With 8-way GPU servers, it may become $3.5 million worth of equipment in that rack.
Yeah.
And so if you're spraying water all over the place, it has what we call in the business the failure domain sort of grows, exponentially. actually, when we got into the study of it, though, there were other more sort of fundamental thermodynamic issues with water. It has sort of a pragmatic heat removal ceiling, which the chip makers and the server OEMs are becoming concerned about now. And that's why I think everyone sort of quietly is saying two-phase directed-chip is the future, because right now there's no better technology to remove these very intense heat fluxes and heat loads. The other hype that you'll recall 2.5 years ago was immersion. And again, we a group of people that are from the data center ecosystem, and we said, well, that seems kind of like a dramatic leap. I think it captured the imagination of people, especially lay people. We're going to immerse electronic equipment in this sort of dielectric fluid. Isn't that really kind of sci-fi-ish and cool? But we thought, wait, what a break from legacy infrastructure. You can't use raised floors. It's single-phase immersion's not that effective at removing heat. Two-phase immersion's extremely expensive. We just saw all kinds of issues with this technology, even though we were sort of excited that it would find a use case.
Yeah.
Immersion. It's not going to be broadly adopted, but we'll find a use case. But we thought that's not it. So we said, we need to design a technology that has this future-proofing, that doesn't have the potential of damaging the equipment it's designed to protect effectively, right? Yeah. It's not a kind of a fox in the henhouse kind of situation. And we needed to design it within that sort of design vocabulary of a data center operator. So it had to be very serviceable. Every module needed to be hot swappable by a relatively low level technician, just like data centers are designed today. Hot swap, nothing's fixed in a data center. You swap things. And so we kept all that in mind. And that's what led us to our first sort of in-rack modular solution, which is in the market today.
Interesting journey. And I obviously mentioned at the top of the intro, a lot of this not necessarily is solely being driven by one of the main factors is obviously environmental impact of AI. And obviously we've talked about, you just talked about water and actually the drain on some of the resources as well. I think there was a World Economic Forum report that said in Virginia's data center alley since 2019, water use has skyrocketed 2/3. So it's obviously we've seen a direct impact. If you look at AI from a high level, for people listening, what is the environmental impact of AI adoption when it comes to data centers? Because obviously everyone looks and thinks AI is there, and they don't really consider how is it there.
Yeah, it's tremendous, and we need to be careful about that. And I know there's a sort of a dialogue in the market, which is, well, we need AI to solve the environmental impact. So if we move fast enough, I'm not really an advocate of that. I think we have to be careful as we go. We can't destroy the earth to save the earth. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. If you look at water consumption for AI, a ChatGPT query takes about a half a liter of water. So
wow. Okay.
It's pretty amazing when you think about the power density of the racks. You're going from an average today of about 7.5 kilowatts per rack, per IT rack in a data center, to 50, 100. Our next product's going to be 250 kilowatts. So the power density is just enormous. So what does that mean? In my mind, that means that we cannot be, and I use the word glib a lot, maybe indifferent is a better word. The hyperscalers were bragging about very low PUEs for a long time, but they weren't publishing their water figures.
Okay.
So it came to this, from a sustainability or earth standpoint, it came to this sort of contradiction. Well, we're going to locate data centers in Phoenix or Austin, Texas, where we are located, because we can have evaporative towers on the ceiling, and that's a very efficient way to cool the data center. Okay. Except you're locating these data centers in places that already have low water in their aquifers. We don't. We're out of water, so this seems absurd, and I think we want to get away from that sort of absurd kind of, model. And I think the way to do that as best we can is to make every watt count. So do focus on PUE improvement. I mentioned this indifference. Most colo centers have had PUEs of 2.2 to 2.5 over the last 20 years. Very high PUEs. So very, very inefficient, which means 40 to 50 to 60% of their energy has gone into cooling and not into compute.
Wow, okay.
So if you have trouble securing power, and I know you're all over this, I'm sure, with your other podcasts, but securing land and securing power, securing water, you need to make every watt count. So if you can secure 100 megawatts, you don't want to spend 40 of those megawatts cooling your data center. You want to use 100 megawatts to do computation.
Yeah.
And this is going to be important in inference engines that are going to be smaller but spread across urban areas. It's going to be important in big modeling, which is typically farther away from urban centers and closer to power sources. But in either case, you want to make every watt count. And you want to reuse water in an efficient way, in a closed loop in the data center. And you want to cool with two-phase to create the most efficient cooling loop you can. And, our to cool 100 kilowatts of IT equipment requires a few hundred watts of power for us, for our solution, as opposed to thousands of watts blowing air through a rack.
It's interesting because you touched on something right at the beginning that you're in one of the fastest growing spaces in the world, AI. It's moving at such a rate. It's just going to continue. And your business is 2.5 years old. You're now in this competing in a space where they're typically a bit more risk averse. They're slower. How are you building that kind of awareness? Because obviously you're talking to me here, the light bulb moment is like, obviously everyone needs an Accelsius. This is obviously, the solution to a major problem here. But how are you building that kind of brand awareness, the kind of subsequent, obviously, ARR? I'm really keen to kind of talk about that go-to-market piece because people always find it fascinating. They think that obviously you turn up these events, and I know you're big in kind of trade shows and events, and people are just going, great, sign on the dotted line. But how does it work for you coming in as the president and the CEO saying, right, how are we going to grow this?
It's a really interesting challenge because I think you do have conservative buyers on one side. You have sort of the first movers in water-based cooling on the other side. You have hyperscalers that are a large part of the buying power in IT infrastructure today, data center infrastructure, and are going to become a larger proportion over the next 3 to 4 or 5 years because they're the ones with the deep enough pockets to invest in these large LLMs. So how do you move the needle on this? Well, we found that a little bit of humility helps. So one, we get the message out. We got to have a great marketing team. So we've actually had number one or number two share of voice for the last 3 quarters in liquid cooling, which we're really proud of. And that's all due to our marketing team being fairly provocative, having thought leadership pieces, et cetera. But the bigger issue really is this, that if you have a large global co-location company or a hyperscaler, they're going to look at us and say, we love your technology, but can you scale with us? Yeah. And that's why it's really important for us to take sort of a humble position, not terribly prideful, and say, we need the right large partners in the market for that credibility, that market reach. And so that's what you're going to see from Accelsius over the next few months. You're going to see a string of announcements about global players who can bring us to the market. We don't have to do this on our own. We couldn't do it on our own. Just the aspect of data center integration is such a monstrous exercise. Yeah. We're one part of that. We're one point solution in that rack. You have power conditioning. There's a lot of challenges there, as you know. You have switching, which is another area of a lot of challenges. You have the servers, et cetera. So the ecosystem is complicated by the need to integrate all these things. And we have to work within that ecosystem with the right partners.
You're talking more from like a channel and distribution standpoint. So making sure those people are aligned to, from a product standpoint, but also from their end customers, you can deliver the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And we make it easy for them to integrate it as part of a broader solution or broader rack architecture.
Yeah, it's really interesting you touch on how all the various elements within those racks have effectively got to integrate together. So you kind of almost like crossing your fingers that they're innovating at the same pace as you, because you kind of almost need to make the thought, well, actually, we're pushing the needle here. Is it over everyone else's?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, we need to, and that's why you'll find some of our postings a little provocative, because we can't be as patient as we'd like to be.
No.
We've some of the chip makers are already saying you got to think about two-phase already.
Okay.
So when we meet data center operators who are saying, no, we're all in on air and water, or we're experimenting still. Sometimes we have to push pretty aggressively and say, you don't have 3 or 4 years to figure this out. By the time AMD's probably next generation comes out, or NVIDIA's Rubin comes out, there's going to be heat fluxes that you're not going to be able to deal with your current architectures. So sort of come on this journey with us, and we'll help you in a very empathetic way. We'll help you kind of ride this journey out. We're not here to preach. We're not here to say you have to move directly to nirvana in terms of data center cooling architecture.
Yeah.
There's a journey here, and it's complicated, and there's a lot of pitfalls along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting on the kind of the journey piece. You've obviously been on your journey yourself last 2.5 years. Looking back at those kind of couple of years, what do you think stands out in terms of some of the biggest challenges you've had to overcome? Because obviously you've taken a company from said headcount to, as you say, nearly 70 or so, really well regarded hire within Austin. Obviously the product's doing well, but if you look back and you had your time again, what would you kind of do differently? What have you had to overcome?
Well, the challenges we've had to overcome are, I think, typical for early stage, particularly hardware companies. My last startup was a software platform, a SaaS platform. It's very different in terms of who you hire, the velocity of development. Prototyping hardware is different than doing a sprint in software. You have to order the part, you have to design the parts, you have to share the CAD files, you have to order from a string of contract manufacturers. So by necessity, it's a slower sort of iterative process. It's also a more expensive one. So you have to make the right choices faster. When you're, again, developing a SaaS, and I know a lot of people who are listening probably are maybe CEOs of SaaS companies, you design what's necessary, what's urgent in the next sprint. You put it in. If you find over time it's not that necessary, you take it out. If it's an unpopular feature or function. In hardware, it's harder to do because you need to design the parts. You need to then do the test builds. You then need to test the performance parameters of the product, et cetera. So, initially, this was invention. We sort of invented much of this technology two-phase cooling has been around for 100 years, but in a massively paralleled sort of environment where workloads are spinning up and spinning down, and you have to create stable flow and stable cooling, it's a challenge. And so we've had to invest in ways that most companies haven't. I think we're about to get our 5th PhD on board. We've hired a lot of experienced engineers. They're not, young kids who are doing coding at night. So the OpEx is different. The burn is different. And I think that one thing we did well early on was we canvassed the market. So the marketing team, myself, we'd literally call contacts and say, okay, here's what we're thinking. Why are we being dumb? To just critique the heck out of us. Why are we being misguided? And we changed direction a few times based on the distillation of some of that feedback. So, I don't know what would be different. I think we'd probably spend more time, we'd probably create a more rapid product release process.
Okay.
I think sometimes we got a little bit into a spin around, is this feature really worthwhile? If it is it a really heavy lift in terms of development? And I'm not sure we moved with the right velocity up front. I think, though, now looking back, I'm pretty happy with where we arrived, right?
Yeah, we should be. Obviously, looking at what I can see online, and obviously looking into the backstory and ultimately the problem you're trying to solve. There's no surprise that you've had a, really kind of, obviously albeit challenging, but, really productive 2.5 years. And as you said, there's going to be a few announcements coming up. What I'll make sure I do is I'll tag Accelsius into the release. And obviously, I'm assuming on your website, people can take a look at some of the case studies, can take actually look at the solution. I know you've got some video content on there as well.
That's right.
Fantastic. Josh,
I think people, if they go on our website, they can become fairly familiar with what we do and why we're doing it.
Awesome. No, well, thanks again. As I say, it's been really interesting. I know there's going to be probably some follow-ups, some questions, and I'll make sure that you're definitely tagged in the post as well. But thanks for coming on. It's been my pleasure to have you on today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh.